The Ugly Duckling. In a clump of leaves by the edge of a pond, a mother duck sat impatiently on her eggs. She longed to glide on the water under the summer sun, but she had to wait until all her ducklings had hatched. At last the eggs began to crack, and little heads poked out into the world. The other ducks gathered around to admire the new arrivals, but there was one egg, much larger than the rest, that still hadn't cracked. "That's a turkey egg if I ever saw one," quacked an old duck. "Just leave it. You'll never teach that one to swim." "I've waited this long. I can wait a little longer," said the mother duck. Shortly after, there was a tap and a crack, and the last duckling tumbled out of its shell. But was it a duckling? It was bigger than the others and very ugly. "We'll see," thought the mother duck. She guided her ducklings down to the pond, and one by one they jumped in. They disappeared under the water. Then they all bobbed up again, floating with perfection. "So you're not a turkey," the mother duck smiled. "You're just a big, ugly duckling." She took her ducklings to the farmyard, where the ugly duckling was immediately picked on. The geese hissed at him, the hens pecked at him, the turkey puffed himself up like a ship under sail, and chased him with a fierce gobble, gobble, gobble. Even the ugly duckling's brothers and sisters teased him, and his mother was too embarrassed to comfort him. The poor ugly duckling was so miserable he ran away, flying over a fence and landing in a bush. Little birds darted up in fright. "They're scared of my ugly face," he thought sadly. He stumbled on to the great marsh where the wild ducks lived, and hid there all night long. In the morning, the wild ducks flew up to look at him. "You're very ugly," they quacked, but they let him stay and drink the marsh water. Suddenly, bang, bang, shots rang out. Hunters were firing at birds from all sides of the marsh. The wild ducks took off in a panic as hunting dogs splashed through the water. The ugly duckling hid his head under his wing. Splash, splash, a massive dog appeared above him, his tongue hanging out and his eyes glaring. He opened his mouth wide, flashing his sharp teeth. Then splash, splash, he was off again. "At least I'm too ugly to eat," trembled the ugly duckling. He kept low in the reeds for the rest of the day until the gunshots finally stopped and the hunters left. Then he fled across fields and meadows, buffed by a stormy wind. As night fell, he reached a run-down old house. One hinge had come loose on the door, which was slightly open, so the ugly duckling squeezed inside to take shelter from the storm. In the light of morning, the ugly duckling met a bossy hen and a curious cat, who lived in the house with a little old lady. "Can I stay here?" asked the ugly duckling. "Can you lay eggs?" clucked the hen. "Can you arch your back or purr?" mewed the cat. "I don't think so," said the ugly duckling. "Then keep out of our way," they replied. So the ugly duckling stayed in a dark corner. He thought of the fresh air and the sunlight, and had a sudden desire to glide over sparkling water. "I don't belong here," he sighed to himself, and he went away to a large lake. Every day he swam and dove, but no animals would talk to him because of his ugliness. The weather grew colder, and the forest leaves turned yellow and orange. One evening, a flock of majestic white swans soared across the sunset, headed for warmer countries. The ugly duckling watched them in wonder. He had never seen anything so beautiful. Winter was long and cold. Snow fell, and the lake iced over. The ugly duckling barely survived, huddled beneath the reeds. Eventually, spring came, and he stretched out his wings. They were longer than before, and stronger. Their powerful strokes lifted him out of the reeds and carried him to a large pond in a beautiful garden. Three magnificent swans were already swimming in the pond. The ugly duckling hung his head in shame. These birds were sure to peck at him for his ugliness. But then he saw his reflection. Looking back at him from the water, wasn't an ugly duckling at all. He had turned into a beautiful swan. The other swans swam around him, stroking him with their beaks in welcome. As he stretched his neck in delight, several children ran up. "Look, there's a new swan," they cried, "and he's the most handsome of them all." The end. The Emperor's New Clothes. There was once an emperor who was so fond of clothes, he hardly thought about anything else. He ignored important business and avoided his advisors. He preferred to spend his days in front of a mirror trying on fancy frilly shirts and preposterous pantaloons. One day, two strangers came to see him. "We make the finest clothes in the world," they said smoothly. "In fact, they are so incredible they can only be seen by clever people." "Really?" said the emperor. "Oh, yes," said the men. "They're completely invisible to anyone stupid, or anyone who can't do their job properly." The emperor rubbed his chin. "They sound astonishing," he chuckled. "Make me a new outfit at once. It'll be just the thing for my next procession. I want something so amazing, people will talk about it for years." "It won't be cheap," warned the men. "I don't care," the emperor declared, and he gave the men a sack full of gold coins. Several days later, with a great fanfare, the men unveiled the new clothes. The emperor gulped. He stared. He couldn't see a thing. "I must be a terrible emperor," he thought, but out loud he said, "Wonderful." Nervously, he tried to put on the invisible outfit. Carefully, the men buttoned invisible buttons and tied invisible ribbons into an invisible bow. "How do I look?" asked the emperor. His advisors glanced at each other. They couldn't see anything either, but they didn't dare to say so. "Magnificent!" they cried. So the emperor set out proudly on the procession. A huge crowd had gathered to see his new clothes. Everyone had heard, only clever people could see them. "Amazing," they told each other, until a small voice piped up. "Oh," said a little boy, "the emperor's got no clothes on." The people around him took another look. "He's right, you know." They began to laugh. "The emperor's got no clothes." The emperor glanced down and blushed from head to toe. "I've been tricked," he realized, but there was a procession to finish. So he held his head high and strode on. "At least this is an outfit they'll always remember it," he sighed. The end. The Little Mermaid. Far beneath the waves lived a little mermaid. She was the Sea King's daughter, the youngest of 6 beautiful sisters, all with long, flowing hair and eyes as blue as the deepest waters. Their home was a coral palace, where fish flitted through great halls. Outside the palace was a garden, with flaming red and deep blue trees growing in the soil of the finest sands. Each princess had her own plot where she could plant whatever she liked. One of them made a flower bed shaped like a whale. The youngest made hers as round as the sun, and there she grew only scarlet flowers, as rosy red as the sun itself. She was a strange child, quiet and wistful. While her sisters decorated their gardens with all sorts of treasures rescued from sunken ships, the little mermaid had only one white marble statue of a handsome boy. Nothing gave her more pleasure than hearing about the land above the waves. "When you get to be 15," her grandmother said, "you will be allowed to rise up out of the ocean and sit on the rocks in the moonlight. to watch the ships sailing by. As each sister turned 15, they swam up to the surface. Back they came with stories of sun, sky, and people. The little mermaid listened longingly. Once, after a storm, she'd rescued a human prince from drowning. She never forgot him. One day, she vowed, I'll find my prince. On her 15th birthday, her grandmother combed her flowing hair and let oysters attach themselves to her tail. Ow! Cried the little mermaid. But her grandmother replied, Be still. Don't you want to look beautiful for your birthday? Do humans think we are beautiful? Humans, scoffed the grandmother. They don't have tails like us, but ugly legs instead. At last her grandmother finished, and the little mermaid rose up through the water as light and sparkling as a bubble. The sun had just gone down when her head rose above the surface, but the clouds still shone, golden and rosy pink. The air was mild and fresh, and the sea unruffled. In front of her lay a great three-masted ship, lively with music and singing, and brightly lit by hundreds of lanterns. The little mermaid swam up to the window on the main chamber, gazing at the crowd of brilliantly dressed people. The most handsome of all was a young prince with big, dark eyes. My prince, she thought, and love for him flooded her heart. Sighing, she dove back down to the bottom of the sea and her father's palace. But many evenings and most mornings after that, she swam up to where his palace stood, desperate for just a glimpse of the prince. One night, her father held a court ball. Amidst the singing and dancing, the little mermaid slipped away to sit sadly in her garden. All she could think of was the prince. If I had legs, she thought, I could be with him forever. So she decided to visit the sea witch to ask for help. Raging whirlpools blocked the way and branches of worms grabbed at her hair. The little mermaid was terrified and nearly turned back, but she remembered the prince and summoned her courage. Binding her hair tightly to her head, she darted through the water like a fish. In a muddy clearing, she found the sea witch, feeding toads. I know exactly what you want, foolish thing, said the sea witch. You want 2 legs so you can walk about like a human creature, and have the young prince fall in love with you. At this, she gave a loud, cackling laugh. Well, I can make a potion, but if I give you legs, every step will stab you like a sword. You will lose your voice, and you can never be a mermaid again, she warned. What will I have left? Asked the little mermaid. Your beauty, replied the witch, but beware. If the prince doesn't love you back, you will die. Do you still want the potion? Yes, the little mermaid said, thinking of the prince, though her voice trembled. She swallowed the potion the witch poured for her, and fell instantly asleep. When she awoke, she was lying on the beach, and her prince was bending over her. Who are you? He asked, but she had no voice and couldn't utter a word. I love you, said her eyes. You remind me of a maiden I dreamed of when I nearly drowned, said the prince. Come, walk with me to my castle. Every step was agony. The little mermaid stayed with him, but the prince only loved her the way he would love a younger sister or a pet. Once, walking by the sea, she saw her own sisters. Come back, they chorused, stretching out their arms, but the little mermaid knew she couldn't return to her old life. After a time, the prince told her he was to be married. My princess looks a little like you, he smiled. Aren't you happy for me? The little mermaid's heart broke. She went to the shore where she saw her sisters, all with short hair. We gave the sea witch our hair for a magic knife. If you just kill the prince, you can be a mermaid again. The little mermaid took the knife from them, But then she flung it into the foaming waves. I could never hurt my prince, she thought. I still love him. With that, she slipped into the sea and disappeared forever. The end. Thumbelina. There was once a woman who desperately wanted a child. She wanted one more than anything else in the world. So she went to a fairy for help. The fairy couldn't bear to see anyone unhappy. I'll give you a magic seed, she said. Plant it and see what happens. The woman was doubtful, but she did as the fairy said. Instantly, the seed grew into a wonderful red and gold flower, so lovely that the woman kissed it. As she did, its petals opened to reveal a beautiful tiny girl, no bigger than a thumb. I'll call you Thumbelina, smiled the woman, and made her bed out of a walnut shell with rose petal sheets. Thumbelina lived happily with her mother until one night when a hideous toad hopped through her bedroom window. Just the wife for my boy, croaked the toad, and stole Thumbelina as she slept. Thumbelina woke up and screamed. Meet your husband, said the toad, gesturing to her large, lumpy son. But I don't want to marry a toad, said Thumbelina. Please let me go home. The toads ignored her pleas and imprisoned her on a lily pad in the middle of the river. Thumbelina began to sob so loudly that all the fish in the river heard. As soon as the toads left to search for food, a school of fish swam over, nibbling through the stalk of the lily pad until it broke free. Thumbelina sailed away, floating past villages, woods, and wide green fields. A big brown beetle spotted her and dove down, grabbing her in his claws. Look what I found, he boasted to his friends. Ugh, she's ugly, they said. Take her away. Well, I don't want her if she's ugly, said the beetle, and dropped Thumbelina in a field. For tiny Thumbelina, the towering blades of grass were like a forest. She wove herself a bed out of a leaf, sucked honey from flowers, and drank dewdrops. There she stayed happily all summer long. Swallows sang and swooped around her, so she was never alone. Then winter's icy breath sent the swallows away. Thumbelina grew cold and hungry. Would you like to share my home? Offered a kindly field mouse who had noticed Thumbelina shivering in the snow. The field mouse's home was snug and a shelter from the bitter cold outside, but it was also gloomy. Thumbelina longed for the bright sun. To cheer her up, the field mouse took Thumbelina to visit her friend the mole, a fat fellow in a black velvet suit. His house, full of rambling tunnels, was even gloomier, so dark that Thumbelina could barely see. In one of the tunnels lay a swallow, deathly still. He had fallen through a hole in the roof. Died of cold, announced the mole. Silly bird didn't fly away in time to escape winter. Sadly, Thumbelina pressed her cheek against his feathery breast, remembering his sweet summer song. She thought she heard something. Yes, a faint heartbeat. He's not dead. He's just frozen, she realized. That night, she crept back to the swallow and covered him with a blanket of woven grass. Slowly, the swallow opened his eyes. I'll keep you warm and take care of you, Thumbelina promised. Every evening after that, Thumbelina brought him water and seeds from the field mouse's store. By springtime, the swallow was well enough to leave. Come with me, he said, and we can feel the sun on our backs. I'd love to, said Thumbelina, but I can't leave the field mouse. She was so kind to me, and I think she'd be unhappy if I left. So the swallow flew off alone, leaving Thumbelina gazing sadly after him. All through the summer, she longed to be living outside, The field mouse noticed how quiet and withdrawn Thumbelina had become. "Don't fret," she said. "I have some exciting news. Mole has decided to marry you." Thumbelina gasped. "But I don't want to marry him." The field mouse was shocked. "Why not? He's rich. He has a big house. What more do you want?" "I don't want to spend the rest of my life underground," Thumbelina tried to explain. "I miss the sun and the sky." "Don't be ungrateful," snapped the field mouse. "Your wedding day is tomorrow." Thumbelina snuck to the door of the field mouse's home for one last look at the sky. She heard a warbling above her, and there was the swallow. "Winter is on its way," he said. "I'm leaving for warmer shores. Come with me." "Oh, yes," cried Thumbelina. She climbed onto his back, and off they flew, over the sea to the warm countries where the skies were pure blue, and wonderful flowers and fruit scented the air. At last they reached a palace surrounded by flowers where the swallow had a nest. He set her down by a large white flower. To Thumbelina's astonishment, out stepped a tiny man with a gold crown and butterfly wings. Every blossom had a similar fairy, but this one was the king. "He's so handsome," she whispered to the swallow, while the fairy thought Thumbelina was the loveliest girl he'd ever seen. "Will you be my bride?" he asked, and she answered with a shy smile, "Oh, yes." At their wedding, the fairies gave her a pair of wings so she could join her husband flying from flower to flower. High in his nest, the swallow sang his sweetest song. The End. The Snow Queen. Once there was a wicked sprite. He made a mirror, a magical mirror, that made everything good and beautiful look horrible and mean. He flew around with it, this way and that, but in his excitement he dropped it. The mirror fell to the earth, where it was dashed into 100 million pieces, each hardly bigger than a grain of sand. When the pieces got into people's eyes, there they stayed, and then those people saw the world in a terrible, twisted way. Sometimes a piece would go into someone's heart, and the heart became a lump of ice. The sprite laughed to see what had happened, and still the splinters flew around in the air. And now you shall hear what happened next. In a crowded town of higgledy-piggledy houses lived two children, Kay and Gerda, who loved each other as if they were brother and sister. In the summer, they played together on the rooftops, or chatted across window boxes of roses. In winter, they huddled together in Gerda's house while her grandmother told them stories of the Snow Queen. "She flies through the streets at night," said grandmother, "and freezes all she looks at." "Just let her come here," said Kay. "I'd put her on the stove to melt." One evening, when Kay was at home, he looked out of his window and saw a flake of snow growing larger and larger and larger, until at last it became a woman. She was beautiful but stern, and seemed to be made of shimmering, sparkling ice. She beckoned to Kay, but he was frightened and turned away. At last, winter turned to spring, and then summer, and the roses bloomed. Kay and Gerda admired the roses, and it was then that Kay cried, "Oh, I feel such a sharp pain in my heart, and there's something in my eye." Splinters of the sprite's mirror had pierced his eye and lodged in his heart. "I think it's out now," said Kay. But it was not. "Look at that rose," he went on. "It's so ugly. You're ugly too, Gerda." Then he kicked the roses with his foot and ran away. All that summer he teased Gerda and mocked her. When winter came again, he didn't want to sit by the fireside listening to stories. Instead, he took his sled and ran into the town square. Spying a huge sleigh whizzing over the ice, Kay tied his little sled to it. Off they raced beyond the town into the swirling snow. When the sleigh stopped and the driver stepped out, Kay saw it was the Snow Queen herself. She was tall and slender, wore a cloak and hat of dazzling white snow. The Snow Queen drew Kay into her arms and kissed him. Her kiss was colder than ice. She kissed Kay once more, and he forgot all about Gerda, her grandmother, and his home. In the town, nobody knew where Kay had gone. Gerda missed him dreadfully, despite his teasing, and when winter was over, she put on her red shoes and went down to the river. "Have you seen Kay?" she asked the river. "If I give you my shoes, will you take me to him?" The river seemed to nod as it rippled, so she threw in her shoes, but they floated back to her. "Perhaps I didn't throw them far enough," thought Gerda, and climbed into a little boat by the bank. She didn't realize it wasn't fastened, and it floated away down the river. Gerda was afraid, but there was no turning back. As dusk fell, the river brought Gerda to a cottage with red and blue windows. An old woman was in the garden tending her roses. She reached out for Gerda's boat with a crooked stick. "Poor little child," she said, "come and tell me who you are and how you came here." Gerda told her everything. The old woman shook her head, saying she hadn't seen Kay, and offered Gerda ripe, juicy cherries. Then she took a golden comb and combed Gerda's hair, combing away her memories as well. She wasn't a wicked woman. She just longed for a little girl of her own. She made the rose bushes sink into the ground in case they reminded Gerda of home. And so the summer days began to pass until, one day, Gerda saw a rose painted on the old woman's sun hat. In a rush, her memories came flooding back. "Oh, how long have I stayed?" cried Gerda, and she burst into tears, which fell to the ground, bringing the buried roses back to life. Gerda knelt down beside them. "Do you think Kay is dead?" she asked the roses. The roses shook their heads. "He is not dead. We have been in the earth where all the dead are." But Kay was not there. "Then I must keep looking," cried Gerda. She ran out of the garden, back into the wild world, now shedding into leaves with the end of summer. Gerda's feet were weary, and the search seemed so long and so hard that she curled up on the ground and began to cry. "Why are you so sad, little girl?" called a raven from its perch. Gerda told him her tale, and he nodded with excitement. "I think I've seen your Kay. I think he has forgotten you for a princess." "Oh, please, take me to him," begged Gerda. "Follow me," said the raven. The raven led Gerda to a palace. Her heart beat with anxiety and longing. They were crossing an echoing hall when Gerda stopped. "I think there is somebody just behind us," she said, and something rushed past like a shadow on the wall. "There are dreams," said the raven, "come to take royal thoughts for midnight rides." At last they reached the royal bedchamber. The ceiling was like a palm tree, with leaves of glass, and from it hung two beds that looked like flowers. In the last lay the princess, fast asleep, and in the second, "Oh, that's Kay," thought Gerda. She called his name, and he awoke, and turned his head. It was not Kay. Gerda sobbed, waking up the princess too. "What is the matter?" she asked. Gerda told her tale, and the prince offered her his bed for the night. The next morning, she was given a carriage of pure gold to continue her journey. Near dusk, the carriage entered a dark forest, shining like a sunbeam. It caught the eyes of some robbers, who rushed at it crying, "Give me your gold." As they pulled Gerda out, a little robber girl called for them to stop. "I will ride with her," she said, taking the carriage to the robber's castle, high upon a craggy rock. That night, Gerda could not sleep. Some wooden pigeons fluttered down, softly calling to her, Coo, coo. We have seen Kay. He is with the Snow Queen, carried away in her sleigh. She was headed for Lapland. How do I get to Lapland? She asked. Ask Ba, the robber girl's reindeer, said the wooden pigeons. As morning broke, Jared awoke the robber girl and pleaded with her to let her go. The robber girl lifted her chin arrogantly. I shall let you go, she said. Ba will take you. Jared climbed onto his back. Farewell, she called, and the reindeer sped on. Over bush and bramble, through great woods and over moor, as fast as he could go. On and on they flew, to the icy, frozen north. Ba set her down outside the queen's palace. I can't take you any further, he said, but you are good and sweet and innocent. You need no more help from me. Gerda ran on as fast as she could. Snowflakes whirled around her, enormous living snowflakes, for these were the Snow Queen's guards. They made terrifying shapes, hissing serpents, snarling bears, and spiky porcupines. Gerda cried out in fear, but she didn't run away. Her breath came out like mist from her mouth and formed angels that fought the guards. Hurrying on, Gerda came to the walls of the palace, which were made of driving snow, and battled her way through entrance gates of biting winds. Inside, she wandered through endless empty halls of snow, lit by the northern lights. And, in the very middle of the palace, on a frozen lake, Gerda at last found Kay. He sat still, so still he seemed to be frozen. Kay, she called, running up to him. She hugged him, her hot tears dripping onto Kay's chest. They reached right through to his heart, thawing the lump of ice. She talked to him of home, and her words and his melting heart brought tears to Kay's eyes too, washing away the splinters there. Gerda, he cried, is it really you? Gerda held him fast and wept for joy. It's so cold here, said Kay. It's so empty and cold. Gerda kissed his eyes, and they shone like her own. We must hurry, said Kay. We must leave before the Snow Queen returns. They took each other by the hand and tore out of the castle, laughing with relief. Ba was waiting to carry them home. At long last they arrived at Gerda's house, where her grandmother was overjoyed to see them. This is truly a fairy tale ending, cried the grandmother. And all the roses in the window box nodded their heads as if to agree. The